Namaskar, everyone, and welcome to ProutSpace, which is restarting after a short or long hiatus, depending on your perspective on time. Maheshwar from Portugal, in Portugal now, is the technical host tonight. And we have people from the United States all around. We have Sister Chitra from Vietnam, 2:30 in the morning. We have Radhan also. And finally, Pradog, I don't know where you are from. Where do you live?
In Zagreb, Croatia.
Zagreb, Croatia, exactly. Thank you very much. Radhan in Puerto Rico, Tapan Malik in also United States and Delaware. So it is a great honor to introduce Sister Satya Tanner from Australia. She has been a Proutist for a couple decades and went through Prout College with Subodh a long 20 years ago and has been working for Prout ever since. And she's doing very exciting work in Australia. And I would rather she explain the exciting work she's doing in Australia than me. I'd mess it all up. So Satya, please, we are honored to have you. We have 90 minutes and we'll discuss later.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Namaskar, everybody. Thank you for that welcome, Dada. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you a little bit about my experience in Australia, in hope that it gives some inspiration for opportunities for you in your local work where you're hopefully able to have some influence as well. And I'm going to start by, I'm going to make it mostly storytelling, but then a little bit of digging into some of the content to give examples of how I'm using Prout content in my context. And what is also very interesting to me is how a lot of these ideas are just arising naturally, and the people that I'm finding myself grouping with are professionals with influence who are also coming to these same conclusions. So just by way of background, I want to tell you a little bit about my my career background or my work-related background, because that definitely plays a role in how I've come to be where I am today. My broad background is that I was in the Air Force in Australia for about 16 years, and then I moved overseas, lived in the US and Denmark. I was in the aerospace and defense industry in total for about 19 years in total. Then including some time when I was in the US for 3 years. And then I moved to Denmark, and I worked mostly in the offshore wind energy industry. So in the renewable space, I guess you could say, with a little stint in oil and gas in between that. My background is that of an engineer, but my time in Air Force, I was both an engineer and a pilot, but when you're an engineer in the Air Force, it's more about project management and less about hardcore engineering. So I'm the kind of person who's always been in a leadership role, managing teams or managing projects, with the exception of one of my last roles in renewables, where I took a specialist role working in project controls on really, really big projects. And some of you may know what that means, some of you won't, but I guess the point being that I've been working in corporate environment, both like large corporations, but also smaller sub-businesses as well, across a number of different spaces: aerospace, defense, renewables, and oil and gas. So I've seen a lot, and I kind of understand how these industries work. So what was of interest to me when I moved back to Australia about 2 years ago, we were coming out of COVID, and industry conferences were starting up again. And I've moved back to Australia in the role as the managing director of a small Danish consultancy. We just have a few people on the ground here in Australia looking for opportunities with offshore wind. So part of that responsibility that I have as a managing director is to do business development. And so part of business development is that my role is to go to conferences, meet people, understand what's happening in the industry, and see where there's opportunities for us to help clients and therefore win business. And so the very first conference that I went to actually is not one that I would have chosen for myself, but incidentally, my company had it listed on the website as one that we would be present at. So I looked it up and I went along. And it was one of the worst organized conferences that I've ever been to in my life. There was only 30 people present. Normally you have hundreds and hundreds of people present. This may have been a result of it coming out of COVID and the lockdowns that had been happening. But I suspect that actually it just wasn't necessarily a very good conference. But what came out of that conference was some very interesting contacts, because they actually had amazing speakers and very few people in the audience. And so a lot of the speakers were quite sort of befuddled as, how have I been invited to this conference when there's so few people in the audience? Anyway, I was one of the people in the audience, and during the break, I had a chat with a woman who'd been up on the stage presenting, and I really liked what she had to say. And her name was Blair. Anyway, we got talking, and I told her that I was working in renewables and that I had a background in offshore wind, and she was super excited. And she said, "Oh, that's great. I'd really love to get to know some people working in that space." And as we got talking, I sort of said to her, you know, I would be, we were talking about sort of the pros and cons, you know, with renewable transition and things like this. And I said to her, you know, my concern for our industry is that the big boys just come in, make all the money, and run off with it. And she was like, exactly, you know. And so we actually, it was a little bit risky for me to say that in a corporate context, because not everyone necessarily, you know, has that perspective. But I just knew from the presentation that she'd given that she was a little bit more about communities and you know, what's good for local economy and this type of thing. So anyway, we ended up building a really great friendship that came from that. And we, even though she lives in Sydney and I live in Melbourne, we built a connection. And when I went up to visit Sydney, she introduced me to a lot of the people that she's working with. So she actually works in the philanthropy space, and she's got a comms background. She used to work for Greenpeace many years ago. She started 360.org in Australia, or maybe it was globally, I can't remember which. And so she's got this real kind of professional but social change kind of approach. And she and is very much in the climate space in Australia, but in quite a professional way. And working with not-for-profits, because obviously being working in the philanthropy space, one of the things that they do is people who have money who want to donate to, for example, a climate movement in some way, or activities that are ethical, because she works for a company called Ethinvest, meaning like ethical investments. You know, they do a lot of due diligence to help find the projects that are actually worthwhile investing in. So she's sort of all over a lot of the space. So when I went up to Sydney about a month or two later, she ended up introducing me to a bunch of actually quite influential people within Australia, people who are writing, you know, for, you know, pro-environment or pro-energy transition, and people who are even on TV, you know, talking about these things that have quite a lot of influence. So it was very interesting opportunity, and it just really struck me, you know, like Satya talks about, he says, you know, unite the moralists, and that's not a self-righteous kind of approach. That is very much go out, find people who have the values that are similar to yours, but also who have influence, and create a network. And it's exactly what I see the opposition in politics here in Australia. I see them doing the same thing. They spread a lot of their misinformation through networks. And the metaphor I want to use is it's almost like a fungal network, and a fungal network can be used for good or bad. But by having all these little groups kind of starting to link up and have some kind of connection in some way, which is not to say that it's one big top-down totalitarian regime. No, it's just that you all kind of are moving in some similar circles and you have some opportunities to catch up every now and again. And as a result, like I'm on a couple of WhatsApp groups where, for example, I'll just go, hey, Collective Brains Trust, what do you think about this thing? And then I get feedback on ideas, or how to frame things that we might be doing for putting something out in the media. So basically, this is to say that what it ended up being was the start of an expansion of my network. And I could see that like everyone had like a different piece of the pie. So I represented industry, and there was other people in my circle that I brought in that represented industry. And then these people were think tanks. So she introduced me to a number of people who work for think tanks, for example. So these are some think tanks that are really influential in Australia. And so they're the people that are often on the news and, responding to, comments and on political topics. Then we've got, the philanthropic people. Then we've got the other types of investors. And anyway, a whole bunch of different groups sort of started to come together to talk about the issue. So basically, Blair then turned around and said, right, I want to have a pizza night. I'm going to grab a whole bunch of the best brains that I know, bring everyone together, and let's think about how we can, help the government, because a new government had been elected that was pro-renewables, and as opposed to the previous government that was very, very backward in that regard, and also pro understanding that we want to do something about climate change, environment, and all these other types of issues because of the economic and other effects that it can have. And so she pulled a bunch of people around to have basically a pizza night. I joined via Zoom, and we just started talking about what do we see the issues to be, and what do we really need to do. And so because a lot of them had an investment background, they basically saw that the government, often governments don't necessarily, there are some people who will understand what's going on in terms of economic situations and can see the big picture, but many politicians are just a bit myopic, or they may not even have a background that really understands how these sorts of things work. So that's why a lot of people go and do advocacy, with government, right? So we were sort of thinking, okay, what is the big ask that we should be talking to politicians about? And so as a result, we came up with a list of 10 points that need to happen now and 10 points that sort of need to happen in the near future in order to help get the capital moving into Australia to help get renewable energy projects going, because the government can't afford it on its own. There needs to be, basically capital moving. And there was some smart ways that we were thinking about how to do that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to share my screen and show you. I won't go through it in detail, but I just want to show you visually the document that we had. Just hold on a moment while I get that up. Okay. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen? Very good. Thank you. Okay, so basically, this is the result of what happened. So, Smart Energy Council, one of the industry peak bodies, was also a piece of that conversation, and one of the pieces of the network that came in as well. So, Smart Energy Council were also involved, and these guys do a lot of advocacy with government, and quite hard-hitting advocacy. There's a couple of different renewable energy related peak bodies, but these guys are have a certain approach, I guess you could say. So you can see here. So basically, as a result of that pizza night, Blair created what's called the Climate Capital Forum, and you can see there it's impact investors, businesses, philanthropists, think tanks, etc. And we launched a blueprint for Australia's reindustrialised renewables-led future. So it was quite interesting here. You can see this, a picture of some of us there. What we did is we started this we set up this discussion paper that sort of talked about the context. And you got to remember, like, a lot of the people in our group are actually comms people. They have a strong history with communication and media. So it was quite interesting to work with them, because it's not a intellectual piece per se. It's one that's designed it's got a different flavor to it, I guess, is my point. And so we talked about the need for action, the economic opportunity, and if I scroll down a bit more, and then here we go, and then it comes down to the recommendations. But in the midst of all of this, what I could see, one of the points that I brought to the table is I basically said, the issue that we have in Australia is we just dig and ship when it comes to mining. We don't do any value add. And we know from Prout that it's really important to do value add, because if you just, if you don't do that, then you miss out on a lot of local economic opportunities. So in putting all that together, I'll just have a look and see if it's on here, or if I need to bring up a different one. Oh, here we go, it's sideways, but I'll find another version. But basically, I put together this slide that showed sort of how I saw that all of our money was disappearing overseas because we were just digging and shipping. And we came up with a diagram that showed if we instead do some value add in Australia, how that money can stay local and how we can keep more money circulating locally. And when I said that, there's quite a few people in the room that have an economics background, and they were also in absolute agreement. So I could see that, like, the mentality of the people was ready for this type, or at least of this group of people, was very, very ready for this type of thinking. So when I brought this idea to the table, actually people were really receptive because they were already thinking in that way. And so what I was able to bring from having a Proutistic perspective, because of this understanding of, Satya talks about how you've got to keep the money rolling, right? So then I was able to sort of see how we can bring these pieces together to keep the money rolling, even though I don't have an economics background. And actually to the extent that a few people, later on, a few months later, said to me, "Oh, you don't have an economics background?" So it was purely as a result of, the study and the reading that I've done, which sort of gave that big picture. And what I find is a lot of people are already working in some small aspect of it. And so just having conversations, natural conversations, not, lectures, but having natural conversations with people, you can start, to join the dots yourself, and also help others join the dots when you're having those conversations with them. So you can see there, then we came up with some fundamental reforms in relation to that. I'm just wondering, are people interested to know a little bit more about the content? I've got a couple of choices here. I can dig a little bit into the content of the types of things that we were saying, or would you like me to continue sort of talking about the journey of where we've gone from there? It's a little bit of a pick a path that I'm giving you at the moment. Are there any particular preferences?
I'm inclined to defer to what you think may be of the most value given the topic in general.
Sure. Okay, no problem. You know what? How about we come back to the content a bit later, because I would also like to finish telling the story, perhaps. And then, Nina's also put in the chat where things were heading. Yeah, okay. So we can come back to the content, maybe even during the Q&A as well, if it doesn't come up before then. All right. So anyway, so I guess, to give a little bit of a summary of sort of where we're at today, I've somewhat accidentally fallen into this incredibly interesting group of people. And then what's also interesting to me is I actually have something to contribute, because there is something about the Proutist perspective that, and I don't talk about Prout to them at all. I just say, oh, what about this and what about that? And so I guess this is the other point with it in terms of my role in the group, is that I sort of feel like I have a somewhat of a big picture perspective, thanks to the study that I've done within Prout. And so instead of saying, oh, hey guys, I've got this great thing that you should all know about, and forcing it on them, I don't do that with them at all. Instead, what I do is I take a solutions-based approach. So as issues come up, I reach back into my Prout toolbox, and then what I do is I bring that to the table. Oh, well, have we considered this? Have we considered shared ownership structures? So that's one of the directions that it's moving in now. So let me just explain sort of what happened then. So then let me just pull up another slide deck as well. Just one moment. So then they basically invited me to speak. They held some kind of invite-only conference in Sydney where they invited a few politicians, and there was about 100 or 200 people in the room that were invited from industry to sort of talk about. They had like a full day program, or maybe it was even, no, was it 1 or 2 days? Yeah, it was just a 1 day program. And so we were slotted in. It was Blair, one of the economics guys, and myself. And so because I have a defense background, national security also plays a role in the content that we'd put together. And the way that I see it, if I can just sort of summarize it quickly, is to say that the role that renewable energy plays in society is that if you have access to energy locally, that is really helpful for your local economy, because you are self-sufficient. And the way I see Prout is that it's about nested self-sufficiency, and that's actually the framing that we're about to take forward with a bunch of things as well. So I was basically invited to give a talk at this presentation. It was just 10 minutes. I was part of a panel. We were talking about this climate capital forum that we'd put together, and we were talking about the ideas that we were putting forward. And so my role in that was basically, actually, they didn't even specify my role. They just said, would you speak about something? So, because they had some trust. And I thought, what am I going to speak about? Like, I've got, like Blair's got this amazing background with climate movement. Tim's on TV all the time talking about economics. What the hell am I going to talk about? So I thought, well, okay, what is my background? What are my strengths? Okay, I've got this defense background, so I can speak to national security with some level of quote unquote authority. I can speak to the slide that I'd put together, about how the local economy piece works. And that's basically what I did. And I talked about how, we're basically sending all of our money offshore, and that this is our opportunity to get more things happening locally. And what comes with that is national security, because with the climate change that we see happening, there's so many crises going on, not even climate change, that there is, to an extent, global change going on, that we need economic security in order to feel safe. And if we don't have, things such as, economic security in place, then actually the crises that are upon us, it's not even economic security that's the only piece of it. There's a whole bunch of pieces to it, of course, but basically I painted the picture of how dire it will look if we don't actually take action, and how we need to motivate the government to set up the right policy levers so that we can create this different type of environment, And what was interesting is when we gave that presentation, and this would have been, what year are we in now? So this was in January of last year. The leader of the Greens actually was invited to that forum, and a bunch of the Teal Independent MPs. And Teal in Australia is people with green values, but slightly more conservative, maybe isn't quite the right word for it, but somehow slightly more conservative economics. But what's interesting is that I'm finding to be a very interesting space, because they seem to, that particular group are quite open to these types of ideas. But anyway, so the leader of the Greens stood up during his presentation, and apart from slamming the other politicians around him, because that's just what politicians do, and we all kind of went, oh, we don't know if this is going to be good or not, but he basically said, he held up our paper because we had physical copies of it, and he said, this is the roadmap for Australia moving forward. In years to come, people will look back and say that this was what the thing that kicked off the difference, which is pretty amazing, given that it started with pizza around a table with Blair's friends, But what's interesting is it's also that it's the right kind of people around, that are involved. And and not an underground movement per se. to some extent, I actually think he's right, because now what we're seeing is that has really been building and building and building. So, and also I might also add in there, because of my role. So my role, I'm the CEO of a Danish consultancy, and as a result of being with a Danish consultancy, we're involved with the Danish Trade Council, the embassy, all of these types of things. So I end up with some quite interesting political connections that I've never had before. And so about a year and a half ago or something, we were on a Danish trade delegation in Australia, and we were attending a particular conference, and there was a luncheon that was going on. And so the Danish ambassador and the Danish EU member of parliament had been invited to attend, and they were sitting at a table, and they sat down next to me. Anyway, so we all got talking, and at some point, one of them asked a question about, it was something like, like, how do we make this balance between, the fact that it was something to do with borders and trade, and this idea of, like, if we open ourselves up too much, like, it was this idea of, with complete free trade, it's problematic, but, like, where's kind of the line between, they didn't use these words exactly, but I can understand that they were struggling to understand, like, how do we kind of be open but also protect ourselves, And I said, well, because I just used my Proutist thinking, I said, it's all about self-sufficiency and exchanging your excesses, so that you're self-sufficient enough in your little, it's an economic unit, right? But in your own region. And then with the excesses that you have, that's what you trade and exchange. And they both looked at me and went, what? Tell me that again. So, because these philosophies aren't necessarily, it comes back to that philosophical perspective. And it's not that as I said, I'm not an economist, but I understand these broad principles, and I'm not forcing it on people, right? It's coming as a result of just sort of natural conversation and issues. They've got this particular issue, and so I say, oh, how about that thing? And then they're just like, oh, yes, that's it, of course, So now, of course, that doesn't mean that, the Danes have all suddenly adjusted their economic policies, and, because there's a lot of work that goes into that kind of thinking, and it's only two people, and maybe they're the outliers, who knows, right? So anyway, but it's just to say that these sorts of things were starting to happen in the background. And anyway, so fast forwarding back to January of last year, we had this big conference and this thing happened. And then what happened is, because Smart Energy Council, the peak body, were the ones that were hosting these events and inviting people to come, they then made sure, because they were part of Climate Capital Forum as well, they made sure that I was one of the speakers on basically every panel opportunity that we had thereafter. I ended up doing, in total, not just with them, with other people too, I did like 9 presentations last year, most of which I managed to sneak Prout content into in front of quite large audiences in industry. So I'm going to show you a little bit about some of those other conferences and some of the content that came through with them. So let me just pull, I'm going to start by pulling up actually some content from that first one that I did in January of last year. I can see that there's some messages in the chat. I'm not going to look at them just yet, but any questions that you do have, please write them down. And at the end, we'll go through the questions that you have. Okay, hold on a moment. This one. Let me make this. Can you guys see that? Can I get a thumbs up if you can see it? That's the right slide, I hope. Yep. Okay, so actually, let me just go back a little bit. So this is, it was the Industry Climate Action Summit. That's what it was. And you can see we said energy transition is an opportunity of a lifetime. So we can go, because of the global supply chain bottlenecks, we can make Australia make again. Because of local supply chain development, we can remove critical national security vulnerabilities. It was really important to bring the national security narrative into any of the work that we did, because that's what brings both sides of politics along. And ultimately what I came to understand is that everybody is actually concerned about safety. It's just the way that we deal with safety that's different on both sides of politics. So talking about safety is interesting for people. Investment opportunity and sharing wealth making opportunities with regional communities and First Nations, enabling greater security and self-resilience. You can see some Proutistic ideas coming through here, surprisingly, right? I put the slides together. And then the rise of peer-to-peer technologies. So we're seeing new investment models, new shared ownership models with energy market reform. That's a fancy word for the cooperative structures. They're not ready to hear the word cooperative structures, but new shared ownership models goes down well. Then we talked about how the Australian climate economy currently works, which is basically, actually, can you see my mouse when I'm moving it around? You can, okay, good. So we currently have a lot of carbon heavy mining that just dig and shipped overseas. So offshore makes all the money out of it, and the mining companies, but you know, they don't pay a lot of tax here, so that just goes directly into some very wealthy billionaires in Australia who send all the money overseas, or at least doesn't circulate locally in their local economy here. There's a lot of environmental waste that comes from it. Then you've got your secondary industry. So we've got limited onshore processing, and then you've got limited utility scale energy generation with limited local ownership. Then you've got local energy generation such as rooftop solar. So like your decentralized approaches. We've got quite a lot of rooftop solar, but no EV to grid, or electric vehicle is what EV means. Then we've got a vulnerable fossil fuel economy. We only have 3 weeks stockpile of fuel and oil. And this is the national security piece. And all of our fuels get imported through from Singapore through a pretty vulnerable route. And if China, for example, or other countries, have conflict in that area, and at the moment we will see China and Philippines having some tension, then if that supply chain gets disrupted, we're in a pretty bad place in Australia. So this is why renewables gives us energy security, and that ultimately gives us national security. And here you can see the big arrow pointing that all the profits are going offshore, basically, with a lot of this. This is the big boys come in, take all the money and sort of run off with it. So I've slowly been pushing the narrative and then sort of getting louder and louder on some of these things. But then you can see, so what do we want? The greens bits, the ones that we want. So established targets, investment grants, research demand incentives, improved biodiversity and decarbonisation, regional community and First Nations inclusion, because they're mostly being left out. So decarbonisation of mining, that's actually going ahead in Australia now, not because of us, but it personally, but a lot of voices are starting to make that happen. There's a couple of leaders, FFI, Fortescue Future Industries, for example, Twiggy Forrest, you might have heard of him, maybe you haven't. The other mining companies are sort of laggards, but these guys are going ahead because they understand the value of it. This is a smaller arrow compared to a bigger arrow. And so instead of digging and shipping it all overseas, we want less of that. And we want more of onshore processing and more of, local product manufacturing even. Circular economy, so sustainability in mining. Mining's a pretty dirty industry. So no, we don't just want to still do bad things to the environment. Let's invest in research and find ways to do it better. Now, there is a lot of misinformation out there about renewables. A lot of people will say, well, renewables, we have to dig all these new mines and blah, 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 blah. That is true, that some new mines might need to happen, but at the same time, the amount of mining overall is a lot less than it is for fossil fuels. So with a fossil fuel economy, the amount of mining that we need is really huge. I looked at some figures recently. I think it was in the order of, it was like 2 million something compared to like 4 billion something, whatever the unit was. So it was at least 1,000 times more mining is required. Now, that's not to say, and I'm just seeing Maheshwara in my picture here, that's not to say that the Australian lithium mining company that wants to set something up in the middle of Portugal and what is basically a tourist lovely touristy area with beautiful environmental and ecological something is the right place to build a mine. Australia actually has really big lithium deposits, for example, and there's other places that would be better suited. So keep that fight up. Also, you know, so there's some complexity that sort of comes into this. We need it, but we need it in the right places and the places where it's going to make most sense, right? Rational, what is that? Rational distribution, or I can't remember which principle that comes back to. Supply chain biodiversity, supply chain diversity, I should say, instead of being so dependent on China and having like a line, and also Satya talks about this when he talks about having a, was it a network? I can't remember the word that he uses now, but instead of having a chain, that you basically want to have a network that you can pull on. And so that is now we're seeing as a result of COVID and what happened with supply chains getting completely shut down, there was too much vulnerability. So now what we're seeing is that people are talking about supply chain diversity. That's also what's happening within the US with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. That's all about not being quite so dependent on China, and also building up local economy is what we see happening in the US. Then the idea is, you know, we want more local peer-to-peer systems, such as, you know, your rooftop solar, you know, microgrids, cooperative energy producers. So I'm able to stick the word cooperative in here, you know, just on little, you have to be a little bit gentle, and you've got to still take people with you on the journey, if you know what I mean. Microgrids, the right balance of on and off the grid, EV to grid opportunities, utility scale generation with a level of government and or community ownership, so that it's not just the big boys taking the money and running overseas with all the profits, right? Then onshore ownership and profits, so more government, super funds and or community shares. So some of the things that we're talking about is our government has a number of different pools of money, but rather than just being a handout, instead it's kind of like a loan arrangement, and it's like a cheap loan arrangement for various infrastructure opportunities. And what that does is it gives a good deal of certainty to developers and that want to set up projects to help get that going. And by having either partial ownership or access to funding in this way, it's not pure handouts, if that makes sense. So it's whereas what we see with well, actually, how I want to qualify this in the renewable space, no, in energy in general, actually, not even just renewables, within energy, every part of energy gets handouts. Who's getting the most handouts at the moment? It's like fossil fuels and all of them. They get the most. Renewables get the least. Yet, so the renewables, and this is both in Europe and also in Australia. US is maybe a little bit different right now, thanks to the IRA. But I was sitting in a presentation recently, and someone made the comment, and it's this classic argument that people make. Well, you shouldn't be giving handouts to an industry; it should be supporting itself. That's actually not quite true. And so the guy who answered back, you know, to this question, which was around how long does it take for you know, to remove the subsidies or something in renewables. And the guy was an economist who is technology agnostic and industry agnostic. And he basically laughed and said, that doesn't exist. Nuclear gets subsidies, fossil fuels get subsidies, like everyone gets subsidies of some sort. It's just who gets the subsidies. So this is one of the big bits of misinformation, is you'll see renewables being targeted by certain parts, targeted by, frankly speaking, Atlas Network, which is fossil fuel billionaires who set up in Australia groups like Advance, and they've got huge groups in the US that do exactly the same kind of thing. They set up a huge amount of misinformation around these topics in order to keep the subsidies flowing into them, because it's a bit like, I see it like the ship is sinking and they're trying to make the most money out of it as it goes down as they can, as opposed to the opportunity for moving to renewables, if done well. And there are ways that it cannot be done well as well, but if done well, it can bring a lot more economic security, energy security, you know, and a whole bunch of other good things that can come with it if done well, that fossil fuels just simply can't even bring any of those things. Okay, so that sort of explained a little bit of the content of what we've been sort of asking for here, and then this is some of the financing piece behind it, which you can see there's, you know, some federal funding, some time-limited research and development tax incentives, super funds. We've got really big superannuation pension funds here, and the super funds are quite relaxed. No, not relaxed, that's not the right word for it. They're perhaps a little too lazy even in terms of where they invest the pensions of, you know, millions of Australians. So not that you can like force super funds to do certain things, but you can incentivize. So we're, you know, through certain policies, perhaps to, or encourage. And so behind the scenes, some people in our group have been meeting with people on the super fund side to explain and get past the misinformation so they can understand how, if they invest money in renewable projects, how profitable it can be. And we can already see that in Europe, like a lot of the, we can see that in Europe, a lot of the pension funds in Europe have invested in offshore wind, for example, because they get quite consistent returns. And what's great about a renewables energy project, as opposed to many of the others require you constantly feeding something into it to keep it going, be that uranium, be that coal, be that gas. And so there's this, the cost during the operation and maintenance phase is still quite high. Whereas with renewable energy, all of your expenses come in the beginning in what they call the capex. So it comes when you're constructing it. And so as a result, when you've finished constructing it, most of your risk is gone. That's where the biggest costs come. And so you can get quite stable return for the remainder of it. And so for pension funds, this is often a really attractive offer because our money basically is going into these types of projects, and then it's quite a stable return. I don't know what it is exactly, but let's say maybe it's 10% or something like that, which is great for people, for individuals and people. And just one piece of it, it's not the only way to get, you know, like shared ownership, but it's one piece of it. Yeah, anyway, and we see here crowding in private capital because the governments don't have enough capital to make this type of transition. But what we're trying to do is make it that a bunch of that capital, where possible, comes from that it's blended capital from local people having the opportunity. And I'll get to it shortly, but there's also some really great examples from Denmark that we're now trying to bring in and raise the consciousness in Australia. A lot of people are already starting to see this and think this, and so I'm just connecting myself with other people who are thinking these ways, and we're trying to build some energy around it. So then there's some actions that we talked about for the government for reform. Let me just stop sharing that one for a moment. I'm just going to share a different one. This was the most detailed because this was the real sort of big economic piece, and then I'm just going to show you how the narrative has changed a little bit as we've gone through. So this one. So then these ones are, once again, I kept getting invited by Smart Energy Council to give presentations, which is great. And what's also been great is that they just say, we're sticking you in this area, you speak on what you want, and as long as it's roughly related to the total title, like maybe it's manufacturing or I don't know, something like this. So I had an opportunity to talk about investment in local economy as national security. So what I'm trying to do here is just tie the idea of local economy to the thing that I have a strong background in, which is, you know, defense, so national security. It just gives me the authority to talk about this. This is coming from Sabode's Crisis of the World System, and he talks about the different types of crises. And then I talk about what national security is, and I tell a story about safety, how in Denmark, people, that there's 7 prams lined up with babies sleeping in those prams, and the parents are inside the cafe having their coffee. That's safety. Like, that's normal in Denmark. You don't take your pram inside, you leave your kid outside sleeping. And so this sort of, really makes a lot of people go, wow, like, and people from Denmark have gone to places like the US and left their kid outside and, been almost jailed for it, because, that's considered a really unsafe thing to do. But when the society is built up in a certain way with a certain level of trust, you can do that stuff, because why would you steal someone's kid? Like, it just wouldn't make any sense. And also the parents are just inside, they can see, the kids there. But I mean, people just don't steal babies in Denmark. They don't need to. Then I gave a story about, I gave a summary of a story of what was happening. I think was it in Central America or South America? I can't remember what, but something around the conflict for local. Oh, that's right. Actually, I can see it just in front of me. It was it was in Colombia, and it was to do with the farmers and how they were able to courageously help unite some of the warring factions. So, and as a result of telling that story, I then basically talked about what it takes to have local security in communities. And it's not of no surprise that these things are all the things that we look for in terms of Proutistic values. Guaranteed access to the necessities of life. If people have that, they don't need to steal from each other. It's suddenly a lot safer. Healthy economy and jobs. This is the piece that I think that sometimes the environmental movement can leave out. They just, there can be this mentality of, oh, we can all just live off the land. No, it doesn't actually. It's not quite like that. We do need some type of innovation, industry, even just energy. We can't go backwards in certain technological ways either. Equity, inclusion, health, governance. Anyway, there's a few things in there. And then I showed my slides again. And then that was the end of that one. Let me go to another one as well. Share the next one. Then I gave one in Brisbane about, I don't know, a few months later. So this was in about September of last year. Let's come back here. So it was how renewable energy can be a vehicle for resilient communities and economy in Queensland. So I started by saying that there's a plan in Queensland. Queensland's one of the states in Australia. And what they do, which is really interesting, is they always take at least a 50% stake in any energy generation project. So that's great, because all the money that's made, 50% goes back into the coffers, back into Treasury for that state. And this is smart, because this works. And the states that are struggling don't necessarily have this setup, but also it's hard for them to suddenly take on this setup as well. They would have, there's governments, other state governments, and even the federal governments have been stripped of their corporate knowledge, of their expertise, thanks to outsourcing to huge consultancies and previous governments that took the approach that government's role is just to run contracts and then leave it to the market. This perspective hasn't worked at all. So, crisis of the world system, back to Sabode's thing again, safe and secure communities, same principles. You can see I just sort of recycling a lot of these ideas, because people often need to hear it over and over, but I just tell it in a slightly different way each time. This is where I really delved into the work of John Blackburn and looked at security being an outcome of resilience in particular. So you've got national security or national resilience leads to national security. Energy resilience is just one piece of national resilience. And often it's been thought that energy resilience is just about supply chain, and that's a market thing. But it's not, because if you just leave it to the market, you end up in the situation that Australia was left in, whereby basically they got rid of all of our oil refinery because it was too expensive to run, and it was just a race to the bottom. So we got rid of everything, just became just in time and shipped from Singapore. Okay, that's great if you're just leaving it to the market, but it doesn't do anything for our national security, because now we don't have resilience. Because, as I said, if there's conflict in the South China Sea and our supply chain gets cut off, we are in a very bad place as far as energy security goes. So the point that John Blackburn raises is that it's all about this. You need protection of your way of life, otherwise it's a race to the bottom. So that's where government's role is, to step in and actually provide a certain minimum level of something, whatever that may be. And that is what, so the government's role is to set the policy that ensures that minimum way of life, and then you can leave it to the free market, but you've got to tailor it. You can't just go free market, whatever you want. No. And this is how I also see that Prout plays a role, right? Because we do have capitalism in Prout. It's just limited to that first tier of economy, right? That small business tier. That's in the Proutistic piece. That's where it comes in. And to some extent, obviously, it also comes in the second tier with the idea of cooperatives, because there's still some capitalism, the capitalist dynamics that go on in that place. But the point is that governments have a huge role to play in shaping the policy that determines where that type of thing can play, because the capitalist mentalities can play a really innovative entrepreneurial role, but they can also take over the world and, make us all suffer. So it's about containing it to a place that works for everybody in a healthy way. All right. And then I think, great, this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about local economy. So I do. I use some words that we're familiar with: keep the money rolling locally. And I talk about some of these ideas. I talk about how Saul Griffith did a study in his postcode here in Australia and found that $20 million goes out of his postcode every year through the petrol station, and it employs one person. And he compared that to, in his study, he compared that to if everybody had a rooftop solar battery, because that gives firming, and an electric vehicle, and electrified their homes with certain appliances, that individuals would make a savings of $3,000 to $5,000 a year, and on energy and, on electricity and fuel. You would employ, I think it was over 150 people in the postcode, because suddenly you got tradespeople who were taking care of the solar and so forth. And $11 million would stay in the local economy. It was something like this. I might not have the figures perfect, but it was something like that. And so by keeping that money rolling locally, that is, you end up with $10 million a year, I think it was, he said, in the hands of overseas, oil barons, basically, as opposed to keeping money circulating locally. So this is where I just presented some of those ideas, and also talked about, once again, new equity models. I slowly built up the new equity models. Each presentation I shifted more and more and more into that side of it. Talked a little bit about the futures triangle for energy, which I just sort of came up with some ideas. What are the drivers that we see? What are some barriers? What are some of the pulls? And then use that to bring up one of Subodh's pieces on, this is from his, Crises of the World System, where he sees it being about, the paradigms of change. You've got no change is the first column, marginal change is the second, adaptive and radical, and futurists are basically saying we've got to be ready for, adaptive is already coming, we've got to be ready for radical change. And so then I adjusted this for energy, and just sort of talked about, I won't go into the details of it, but just sort of it was a way to sort of break people's minds open to, hey, there's huge philosophical changes happening. We're no longer doing top-down energy. We've now got, peer-to-peer distribution, all these other models, and institutions need to be ready for this kind of stuff. And then one more I'm going to show. And then we can go into, get ready for Q&A. Here we go. And here's the latest one that I've done. And this was just recently, hold on a second. So just recently, Smart Energy invited me again to be part of a panel. And the three of us, Tim, Blair, and myself, were still on it, giving Climate Capital Forum related, ideas out there. And we're on a panel with a couple of other people who are quite influential in the industry space, and also the Deputy Indian High Commissioner was also on the panel. So we were talking about Australia's opportunity as a renewable energy superpower, which basically means instead of exporting all of the fossil fuels, there's fossil fuels that we currently export, which will be under threat because renewables are taking off in other places. That's $300 billion a year for the Australian export economy, and that has huge economic impact if we don't replace it with something. Australia is really well positioned to export basically these things: green metals, green feedstock, decarbonised products, through various technological means as a result of the renewable energy and the sunshine and wind that we have here. So we can help the world decarbonise. Australia can play a role in decarbonising 6 to 8% of global emissions just through our exports to China, for example. So we talked a little bit about this. I once again talked about the energy security piece. I talked about how our fossil fuel issues, and how we saw that when Russia invaded Ukraine, that all of a sudden Europe suddenly understood what fuel security meant very, very tangibly and quickly had to do something about it, and how Australia needs to be ready because a similar sort of thing could happen to us here. So I basically then talk about, you can see down the bottom there, Australia needs a good grasp on climate, social, economic, and other risks, and resilience, strategic self-sufficiency, and preparedness are key. Renewable energy is energy security. We have these vulnerable fuel imports through here versus renewable local resources. And I talked about Saul Griffith's postcode analysis once again. And then I talk about how utility renewable energy is economic security if done well through shared ownership structures, aka cooperatives, because that's exactly what they do in Denmark. So in Denmark, what they found is that the onshore wind developers couldn't get what's called social license, which is when people in the community are okay with when the majority are actually on board with the project. They couldn't get that unless they offered up shares in the project. So here's an example of Middelgrund wind farm. Locals and community groups were offered shares around 600 to 700 euros each, and it was coordinated through a cooperative structure. So they ended up taking, I think it was 50% of the wind farm cost, and then they had a big local backer which was one of the utility companies that took the other 50%. So you still need these big ones, but it's like this shared thing. So and what they do is the community, they offer it up to the community first in order to make it fair. Otherwise, the big backer comes in and says, right, I want 90%, and there's only 10% left for the community. That's not fair. What is fair is if you offer it up to the community first, let them take everything that they can, which is never going to be the whole thing. It's not like they have that much money. And they can buy in. They also, you can see they had access, local financiers offered attractive loans. Other places in Denmark where they were doing this, the farmers had a real bumper year, so they had a bunch of cash, and so they reinvested in energy projects. And what they found is they earned more from the energy projects through their shares than they did when they were leasing land for developers to put turbines on their land. So it's really attractive, and people like this, and it keeps the money circulating, locally as well. I think that's the end of that particular presentation. Yeah. All right. So that brings me sort of to the end of my presentation pieces of it. I guess maybe I can sort of finalize by saying where things are now. The next push that I see is going to be on the shared ownership structures. And I've recently connected with a woman who is up in one of the really controversial areas that is also really into this. I'm playing a role of trying to bring people in to also start talking with each other too, because the more we do that, the more we talk with each other, the more we can come up with ideas, because people are connected. Like this woman's from a not-for-profit for community energy that's backed by philanthropic organizations. But then we've got access to all these other people in our networks, that can help in various ways. We went with Smart Energy Council in September of last year. We went to Parliament House, and we were about 30 or 40 people. We split up into 5 or 6 groups. And we went and we had a list each of about 7 politicians. We ended up talking to about, 30 to 40 politicians each. And we did a big swarm on Parliament House. So the unions went in the day before us and talked about this renewable energy superpower transition, how we need to have $100 billion. We've got this package idea that we've sort of, put together with things like similar to what's happening in the US with production tax credits, which basically means it's a baby industry, don't tax it now, give it some time to grow, and then tax it, because then you've got something to tax. It's like mowing the lawn. If you, or not mowing the lawn, let's say it's like harvesting tomatoes. You don't harvest the flowers, right? Give it time to make a big tomato, and then you harvest the tomato itself. So these are some of the things that we were not using that analogy, but I'm just using that to explain it to all of you. We were asking basically we said, go big, go bold, and sort of trying to give them the confidence. So one day, as I said, the unions came through. The next day, we came through. So it was this big swarm, and they all got hit up with it, so that we know that they're all talking about it behind the scenes. And this is where Smart Energy Council has been great, because they know how to do lobbying. They gave us some training in it beforehand. We had a big meal around a table the night before, and they said, okay, this is how you do it, and this is how you have the conversation, and here's our talking points, and off you go. So we did. So that was quite interesting. And then also last year, I got a chance they invited me to speak with, I'm just trying to find my notes on it now. It was like a peak body for the people who work in international trade and investment. And so I was invited to give a talk to, let me just find it here, if I can. Hang on a second. Oh, maybe I can't. I'll just have to try and see if I can remember. So I gave a talk to them. Once again, I was in one of those situations where I'm like, how am I talking about this? But what do I know about trade and investment? I don't really know an awful lot, but I thought, well, what I can do is tell stories. So because I was invited to speak on the industry experience of what the US IRA is, which is this big policy that's been set up in the US to basically, there's a lot of Proutistic elements to it, actually, basically to attract more local manufacturing and renewables happening on the ground in the US, and eventually shaping the policy so that over time, only I think 20 or 30% can come from China. The Chinese hate it, and they're taking the US to the WTO over it, and possibly it goes against, the trade, the free trade principles. Absolutely, it does, but it's for the betterment of the US. And so there's a lot of people talking about how, the US might get called out on it, but actually it's what we should all be doing. So it's really interesting. So I stood up at this conference in front of a whole bunch of investment people, and I was telling stories about industry, but I started with a quote from someone that I'd seen at a presentation. A guy from the US came out and said, with the US IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually a renewable energy, policy, free trade as we know it is dead. So I started with, because it was someone else's quote, not mine, I started with that quote and talked about, like what on a basic level, like why that is, and how instead of like that, it doesn't need to be that we go, we've gone from having walls completely up to walls completely open. We don't have to go to walls completely up, but instead we can shape policy to create spaces where we can at least have a certain degree of like local economy and security and self-sufficiency, and why that's important, for every community everywhere. And people were just like, their minds were being blown. And then and then I talked about industry experience of the difficulties that they're having in Australia of being able to scale, because they're like this baby, this little baby organization, and they need certain types of support to be able to scale, and why they're all looking at the US going, oh, the US are offering these great packages for innovation and helping us scale. We're just going to go do stuff there. And I was talking about the mechanics of why that is, because I rang up a bunch of my friends through the Climate Capital Forum and said, tell me a story. And then I just sort of retold their stories. And that also was great for them because they got to promote their business a little bit. And then someone from the US Embassy stood up and talked about how the US Embassy are running it. And then this academic from Perth in Western Australia stood up and talked about it from a academic perspective. And it was so funny because we were all talking the same thing. We were basically all saying, free traders, we know it are dead with this new policy. I could see some. So so very, very interesting, and it will be very interesting to follow what happens with the World Trade Organization complaints that China are making and how that plays out, because ultimately what the US are doing is actually fair. So it does start to question the philosophical principles of all of this, and I think that's a good thing. All right, so I've been talking for long enough. I want to give you guys the opportunity to ask some questions. Thank you very much for your attention so far. So how do we do the question
There are
piece
a
of it?
couple questions in the chat already, Satya. You want to
Okay,
start
all
with
right.
those?
Okay. Where are things heading? I think that came when we were doing the conversation of which directions to go.
Yeah.
So I won't answer that per se. Are you part of VE.hub in Denmark? No. Oh, that's a direct message to me. Sorry. Can you share your thoughts about how these opportunities for presenting Prout concepts was connected to the change in national politics in Australia? Yeah. We've gone from, basically they're called the Liberal Party, but they're not liberal as people in the US would understand it. The Liberal Party in Australia is the conservative. It's one of the more conservative parties. So we've got a Liberal Party and we've got a National Party. The National Party tends to be rural farmers, often quite conservative. Then you've got your Liberal Party, which is more, I don't know if any of you know Malcolm Turnbull. I don't know who are some others that might, maybe some more slightly more notable, but they tend to come from money and more city areas, and they tend to have more conservative economic policies, but they're not quite the same mentality as the National Party. But these two form a coalition. And by forming a coalition, they get the numbers to sort of compete, so to speak, against the Labor Party in Australia. There's also a Greens Party, and then there's a bunch of Teal independents as well, as I said, and also just other independents in general. And this Teal independents group is very interesting because what happened in the last election, the previous government, which was the coalition, they were in power for about 10 years. And these were the guys that brought coal into Parliament and kissed it. And, crazy things like this. But they are very much funded by and influenced. There's certain people within those groups, not everyone is, but there's certain people who are very much funded and influenced by Atlas Network, which you can look up Atlas Network. I'm also part of a pro-democracy group that's quite interesting. The work of Jeremy Walker is very interesting right now. You can see he's traced Atlas Network back. And so because you've got these tentacles that kind of reach down into parts of those parts of politics, within the coalition, they're not all anti-renewables. There's a whole bunch of them that are actually pro-renewables. One of the guys from CCF that we were walking around Parliament House with actually used to be a politician within the Liberal Party. And he's been doing really great work with renewables. But so there were people within the Liberal Party that were actually pro-renewables, but the tentacles of this oil and gas, piece reaches in so that it creates even some challenges within there. And there's this great TV show. It's not a TV show, actually. It's a documentary called Nemesis over 3 series that follows basically the tensions within the party for the past 10 years, the different leaders, and how, you can just see how it unfolds. And if you have a chance to watch it anywhere, I mean, at the moment it's only available in Australia, I think, but if you have some chance to watch Nemesis, it is very, very interesting insight into how politics works, how, and therefore, as a result of that, how lobbying can work. You just very, very good insight. So the change, under the previous government, they banned the use of the word climate change. And as a result, all of the government departments had to use other words. So, for example, in defense, like some of the high-profile people that I know in defense, because of my background, they were calling it global change, because there's a lot changing globally. And that just happened to include some climate stuff, of course, but and there was a bunch of bureaucrats within various government agencies who were secretly creating plans behind the scenes, because they knew that the climate stuff was going to come up at some point and they needed to be ready to roll. So when the government changed over, they could basically pull out the plan and say, okay, here's what we're doing. Or alternatively, they managed to get things funded under special names, special change something project, because the ministers didn't really understand what that meant, what that was really being funded for, but actually it was a program. So it was almost like an underground movement, but it was really, really oppressive, the previous government. So this new government changing across has meant that we can even have the conversation. But what's super interesting is how the narrative in Australia right now is all going pro-nuclear, and it's all coming from Atlas because they got money in it. And they're going through their political networks. And so offshore wind's getting attacked with misinformation. So it's this huge intellectual battle that's going on behind the scenes right now. And then therefore what is happening is, what's important is framing. So this is the work of George Lakoff, and also the work that Subodh talks about, and also that we talk about on our Leadership for Social Change program is talking about these concepts as well. How do you outframe, reframe? Because right now it's a media war. And that's also part of the reason why I'm like, when it comes to LinkedIn and things like this, I ask that if you connect with me, you don't be putting Bhavnam Kevalam Namaskar or anything like that. It's really important that I maintain a somewhat, I have to be careful and protect myself, because I can be, I've put out op-eds in a few of the newspapers through Climate Capital Forum. And I'm quite certain that I'm on the radar, and that if they get a chance to attack me and bring me down in some way, that they will. So it's really, really important to maintain my professional credentials, I guess you could say, and to also not associate myself too closely with one group or another, or be very careful in how I do that. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, Satya, Robert Brooking asked the next question, was written while you were still talking, and then Doris is next. So why don't you answer Robert's first?
Okay, so the one that says, what is the Prout response to eco-political degrowth policies? I don't know what degrowth is.
Could I give a brief explanation?
Sure.
So degrowth is a eco-political movement, and the fundamental premise is that economic growth is a problem, and that our consumption capitalist society needs to be corrected. It's the same premise for why cancer is a problem. Cancer is overgrowth of cells within the body. So their solution, environmental solution, is that not only do we need to not have growth, or not even have a steady state economy of just evenness, we actually have to decrease the size of the economy. I find it to be rather wrong-headed myself, but when my reading of Prout, I think that the proper focus of growth is on the individual, firm, local, and regional scales. If you would just like to expound maybe on what you think there. You've talked a lot about local economies, and then there's this question as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess, first of all, to say that I'm not an economist, and I don't have an academic answer to this, even within the Prout sort of perspective. But what I would say is that it's all about keeping the money rolling, right? At least that's what they say from the Prout perspective. So, and also to do that in balance, that if we look at the principles of Prout, that it's about rational distribution. It's not about exploiting the hell out of every resource that we have. We're trying to get the most out of every resource we have. So I think it's about keeping those principles in play. So I also don't think that it's sustainable to have, I don't know, 20% growth all the time, because that's also not going to work. But I do think you have to have some kind of quote unquote growth, or at least some type of exchange, because if you're having some degree of self-sufficiency and you've got some excesses, then it's about trading those excesses in a way that, I don't know, I just sort of see it like we can't do everything ourselves. No person is an island. One country might be really good at making cars and another country is really good at something else, right? So you have to trade your excesses in a way that is trying to be in balance with the environment as much as possible, because we've got environmental limits. So yeah, I don't know the exact answers, but the principles is I think how that stands.
Doris? Maybe let
Yeah.
Doris go next.
Sure.
Thank you. I was going to ask about how farmers are doing. The European Union is having a huge issue with farmer revolts because of trying to lower methane. And of course, globalization caused a lot of farmers to not get an adequate income. I just wondered if there's some of that going on in Australia as well.
Not yet, because we don't have there's no penalty in Australia right now for carbon emissions. And I don't think that the farmers and our perspective, at least in Climate Capital Forum, is that the farmers aren't the big issue there, and they aren't the ones. Cows farting is not the biggest issue when it comes to methane. It's the huge amounts of fossil fuels that are the biggest issue. But at the same time, there is a transition, and for farmers, these types of things are always going to be scary, or at least for cattle farmers, let's say. They are going to be scared about their economic security. So that's why I also see that renewable energy is an option for them. So the next thing that I also see, apart from shared ownership, is the next area that we really need to push here is dual purpose renewable energy in agrovoltaics, for example. That's where you have not just a solar farm, but you have a solar farm whereby the panels are high enough for sheep to eat grass underneath. And what they've found, there's been studies that showed that those sheep in those environments actually do better. They get shade, the grass grows better under the panels because it's shaded, and they have more, I was going to say fur, but it's not fur. They have more wool, so these are the types of things that I think are going to open more farmers up to this type of thing, or even solar panels over your cherry trees, or whatever the case may be, so that when the hailstorms come through, your solar panels can take it a bit better than your cherry trees can. You can protect your crops. So there's a lot of things I think that are going to happen in that space. And then the final piece, it comes back to this shared ownership piece. So if farmers have the opportunity to earn money through renewable energy projects and or transmission line projects and things like this, then that gives them financial security. Then they don't cling so hard to these things that may or may not be so good for society anyway.
Mm-hmm. So I did ask the question about VHub in Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of that work?
No, I'm not.
Oh, I'd love to connect you to it. Would you
Okay.
give your email address?
Sure, I'll get Maheshwara to connect us afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really good.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions?
I posted a second question. It's a little broad. If there's anything that you want to touch on there regarding security. Do you see the question?
I can't see the question for some reason. Oh, here we go. No, here it is. How can spiritual security be enhanced, and thereby, what do you mean by spiritual security?
Yeah, rather broad, but in the Proutist context, I would relate that to spiritual self-sufficiency, the sort of all of the universe, just basic spiritual health and well-being, if that
Mhm.
clarifies a bit.
Yeah, possibly. I'm just sort of thinking on my feet here. You know, like when we look at like national security, a piece of, I'm just like looking at my notes here. So national security, a lot of people think of defense and policing, but it's more than that. It's also resilience of energy, water, and resource security, it's infrastructure and industry development, diversity and economic competitiveness, it's defense and intelligence, and it's also social and psychological resilience. So I would see that spiritual security forms a piece of that social and psychological resilience as well. In that, I mean, it's a challenging question because spiritual means different things to different people, right? So it's more about the types of things that it points to. So I would think of it as it's pointing to, I'm just thinking about like Sabode's quadruple bottom line paper that he wrote, right? So it's pointing to community spirit, it's pointing to connection, social resilience, thinking about ecology, all of these sorts of things. So for me, I kind of see that using your terminology, then I would think that spiritual security is our ability to feel psychologically secure in ourselves, the ability for larger, like nested groups to feel secure and help each other, and that there's a sense of purpose, that there is a sense of care, yeah, and resilience, you know. And I think like a lot of what we've seen in terms of, we think about business, a lot of business has not been about the sense of why are we here and what is my human purpose. It's more been around how do I make money, right? And so it's been that the humans are working for the economy. So I sort of see that a lot of the work that I'm doing is trying to reframe, but in a clever way, hopefully, that it's by touching on people's individual story to reframe and ask, well, where would you want to live, and would you want to feel safe? You know, when I show that picture of the babies outside the cafe in Denmark, that is a type of spiritual security on some level, somehow, I feel, you know. So
Satya,
yeah,
there's
and I
another
guess your question
question.
is how can it be enhanced? I think it's all of these things that we're basically proposing.
John has a question in the chat. Satya, about
Thank
the
you.
Preston model.
No, I don't know the Preston model.
I guess very briefly, in fact, it actually was modeled after some work that was done with evergreen cooperatives in the United States, but it was an approach where they identified anchor institutions in a local area and started really encouraging, you know, more local purchase to try and start stemming capital flight. And it seems like some of the work that you've been doing in Australia is very much along those lines. How do you start accelerating? You know, we talk about dollar velocity of money, you know, money rolling forward, and a lot of that was based, you know, in that approach, where it was a community that was heavily impacted by some of the shift, you know, in energy, et cetera, and became quite destitute and impoverished. And by really looking at some of that and some of the things that I think you're touching on about, you know, super funds, you know, there's money parked in a lot of places on behalf of a lot of people. And I think the other thing that's sort of something that one of the other things that's happening in the United States more and more is what they call public state and municipal banking. The Bank of North Dakota has been around over 100 years and outperforms banks, but it's the same thing. Instead of funds going to some big institution, you know, a super bank, they're actually going to a public bank and being reinvested within the state. And so during the Great Depression, North Dakota hardly had any impact because they had that resilience that all the funds were recycling locally. They they provide student loans at the lowest rates probably available anywhere. And so I think that's another thing
During
that,
the 2008 recession, you mean?
no, actually clear back to the Great Depression. Yeah, it's been around
1930,
since,
okay.
yeah. And yeah, and the state actually weathered that pretty well as, you know, the 2008 recession and the recessions in between. But it's another area that might be interesting to explore some, because I think it has great potential by, you know, taking government money and keeping it local and being reinvested locally to the benefit of the community, you know, building that kind of resilience and regional independence, autonomy, you know, leadership, et cetera. Anyway,
Yeah.
fantastic presentation.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.
And I just wanted to just make comment on the reinvestment piece. I mean, here in Australia, what we're also seeing is that it's also about regional security. So by helping our neighbours as well, and so our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, we've had presentations by them as a result of our work with Climate Capital Forum, where we got to go through and actually speak to each of the departments and find out what they're doing. What some of the things that they're doing, for example, is instead of just giving handouts now, they're transitioning across to an idea of, I mean, some things will still be handouts to our neighbours, but a lot of it is also, hey, we're going to help you with your energy security. We're going to give you, we're going to invest. We're going to be part owners in your blah, blah, blah. And therefore, we have the ability to basically, it ends up being a loan in effect. And so they invest in the something, and then it can slowly be paid back. And then we take that money back, and then we can invest it into another part within the region. And when I say the region, I mean, obviously not Australia, I mean within like Asia Pacific, right? So, and then at the same time, because the amounts that they're investing, if it ends up being that they don't, it's low risk. So if they don't get their money back, it's okay. It was just like a handout. Okay. But there's this possibility that if it goes well, that the Australian government does get its money back, and then that they can put that money into something else. So yeah, I'm noticing like these mechanisms are coming more and more into play, and it's really important that we champion that, because, and I just see it like a flow of money. The money flows into here. Does some of it siphon off and have the ability to come back and keep flowing in some other way? Are there other questions? We've only got 2 minutes.
There is one question in the chat from Harideva.
Oh yeah,
In New Zealand?
it's totally, yes. That is the Atlas are the Atlas network of right-wing think tanks. That's exactly what they are. New Zealand's starting to wake up to it now. So the work of Jeremy Walker has been coming through. You'll notice that there's, I'm just going to have a look at my pro-democracy group thing here. They recently sent, there's some comics coming out around Atlas network trying to point out that it exists. What's it called? Hang on a second. It's mostly going on Twitter at the moment. Of interest, Elon Musk has been seen pretty close with the people in the Atlas network, and Jeremy Walker, who's done a lot of work investigating Atlas and who they are and where the money comes from, got shut down on Twitter, or now X, whatever it's called, during the referendum that was happening in Australia, because he was very vocal in calling certain things out. So it's pretty snarky territory. If you go look up Jeremy Walker, Dr. Jeremy Walker on Twitter, he's got a lot of great information about Atlas Network and posting a lot of very interesting things. So Harideva, for anything that's New Zealand based, he's a good one to follow. He's been threatened by Atlas Network legally, so he knows that he's making them shake. And Sarabi's asked, okay, the community in New South Wales has been selected by the state government for development of regional job precinct. So a large area on the edge of our small town has been allocated to establish new businesses. How can we implement some of your proposals at local level? Sarabi, that's a long question, but how about we ask Maheshwara to put us in contact, because that's exactly some of the areas that I'm working with is sort of regional New South Wales. Oh, actually, I've already got your number, Sarabi, but I don't know if I have your email. So let's, yeah. Go
I
with
think I
that.
have it.
You do? Okay, very good.
Okay. This program is recorded. It's not for the public, but Proutist can ask Maheshwar for access to the recording, as I will. We want to thank you very much, Satya, and Maheshwar for helping, and all of you for coming.
Thank
Yes,
so
thank
much.
you
very
so
much.
much.
Just an announcement that the last Saturday in April, our next presenter will be Govinda from Philippines, Maharlika. His topic is, if Prout is so intelligent, why it hasn't yet been implemented anywhere. I think it's a very interesting question that has a lot of answers. Why capitalists don't like it, why Marxists don't like it, why different people don't like Prout. And it's interesting to understand all these different problems that people see with it, so that we can understand how to overcome all those. I think it will be very interesting. So thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you next month.
Thank you. See you next month.
Thank you, Satya.
You're welcome.